Hi guys, and welcome back to this journey towards excellent exam results. Thank you for your feedback on the paper 1 revision video. It was pleasing to know that the video was useful and that a lot of what we discussed in the video was in the exam. Today's revision video is for the paper 2 GCSE exam on the 3rd of June 2026. It's a follow-up to the topic 4 video on the UK's evolving physical landscape. And we will be discussing topic 5, which is the UK's evolving human landscape. I have again looked at all the past exam papers for the last 7 years and put together a summary of revision materials for the most examined areas of the UK's evolving human landscape section of paper 2. And this is for the Edexcel B Geography GCSE specification. I will also include some examples of exam style questions that you can use for practice. Please feel free to stop the video and create flashcards where needed. I will also put in timestamps so that you can easily navigate to the sections in the video that you would like to spend more time on. This video only covers the key areas that I examined. If you would like the detailed videos that cover the entire specification for all 3 topics in paper 2, follow the links in the description. Paper 2 has 3 sections. Section A, UK evolving physical landscape. Section B, UK's evolving human landscape. And Section C, geographical investigations. This is a fieldwork in a physical and human environment. We will go section by section, and in this video we will cover UK's evolving human landscape. Okay, let's get started. So we are going to start off with the population distribution and population density of the UK, and we will be specifically looking at core and periphery regions here in the UK. Now, to begin with, obviously, it's important for us to define the terms that we are talking about. And the first one is population density. And population density refers to the number of people living per square kilometer, so in a defined area. Then the distribution refers to how population is spread out over an area. Now, on this particular map that is shown here, it's a choropleth map, and it shows us the population density of the UK. Now, obviously, if a place has got many people living in a square kilometer, then it's considered to be densely populated. And if it has few people living per square kilometer, then it's considered to be sparsely populated. Now, this choropleth map here shows places that have got a population density of over 1,000 people. And as you can see, because it's a choropleth map, that is shaded in a dark shade of green, and then the color continues to lose its darkness until we get to the least densely populated areas, which have under 50 people per square kilometer. Those are the ones that are in the lightest shade of green. It's also very important for us to note that the population of the UK is unevenly distributed. So as far as the distribution goes, it's not evenly distributed. So population can either be evenly distributed or unevenly distributed. And obviously the population of the UK is unevenly distributed. And that's because we have places that have got high density of population and places that have got a low density of population. Now, of course, when we are talking about densely populated areas, we are talking about major cities such as London, Birmingham, Liverpool, Manchester, Newcastle, and Glasgow. Now, these are referred to as the urban cores here in the UK. These areas are the centers of economic activity with the highest number of jobs. They therefore attract a lot of people to come and work in them, creating a high population density. And they are referred to as the drivers of the economy because they drive the GDP of the country. Now, London, for example, generates 22 to 25% of the UK's total GDP. Now, that's almost a quarter of the country's GDP just from one city or from the largest city in the country. So it's obviously very important to the UK's economy. And as these large cities such as London grow, they tend to join up with the surrounding, or to merge with the surrounding towns to form conurbations. But we'll get to that later. So the cities of Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds, Bradford, and Sheffield are referred to as the northern powerhouse for the northern region of the UK. Now, they are also considered to be drivers of the economy because in combination, they contribute largely, they contribute significantly to the GDP of the UK. Now, of course, the areas that are not as densely populated are referred to as peripheral areas or periphery areas. And to be more specific, we refer to them as the rural periphery here in the UK. So the key things here to note are population density, population distribution, conurbation, and then also urban cores and rural periphery. Now, what kind of questions are likely to be asked related to this information here? So the first question here says to state 2 reasons for the distribution of the areas dominated by Generation Y. And Generation Y obviously is the people that are aged between 29 and 44 years of age. The first thing that you talk about here would be availability of jobs, because these are the people who form the working part of the population. So they will be wanting to find employment and therefore are likely to move to those urban cores or to live in those urban cores where they can have that employment. And the other thing we can talk about here is access to services such as medical care or services such as education. Now, we also know that this age group here, 29 to 44, is the age group that is likely to have children, and therefore they will want access to good medical care. We know that medical care is best in those urban cores because we have a variety of medical institutions and services. In fact, we also have a variety of private healthcare services, and that makes those urban cores attractive to Generation Y. The second question here says, compare the importance of London in attracting FDI with the rest of the UK. Now, of course, here we would be talking about the fact that London has got a high population density. That high population density is going to provide a huge workforce, and that workforce is then going to be attractive to those TNCs because they will be able to employ people, and especially people who are very well qualified. We also do know that London has some of the leading universities in the country, which means that the people who are graduating from those universities will then come out into the job market and will be able to fill in those TNC jobs that the TNCs are going to create. The third question says, analyze the information on figure 5, which shows the population of England's 10 largest cities in 2021 and their population growth since 2011. Assess the reasons why population growth varies both within cities and between them. Now, of course, this here is an 8-mark question. And the first thing we would need to do would be to analyze the figure 5 that is being mentioned here. So when analyzing the information on the figure 5 that would be has been given, it's first of all very important to talk about the general trend. So what does the general trend show? And then after that, talk about the highest and the lowest figures that you can see on that particular figure. Then the next thing would be to look for any anomalies, and then finally to manipulate the data or to give a general, a geographical explanation for the information that you can see in that particular figure. Then after that, you would need then to think about the reasons why population growth varies both within cities and between those cities. So when talking about reasons here, we'll be talking about reasons such as employment, the availability of the services that we've talked about, so medical care, education services. We'll be talking about accessibility as well in terms of transport. We'd also be talking about entertainment facilities and so on. So different reasons. Then we would then talk about all these reasons and then come to a definitive judgment or conclusion as to which one we think is the most important in causing that variation between and within cities. A very important thing to note, obviously, when explaining the reasons for this population growth, would be to make sure that we are referencing the figure that has been provided, because that is what the last part of the question says. You must use evidence from figure 5 in your answer. The example of a periphery region here in the UK that our exam board recommends is Allerdale in northwest England. Now, the rural periphery areas are removed from the urban cores, as we have seen in the previous slides. They have benefits and limitations of living in them. Now, what are the benefits of living in Allerdale, for example? So Allerdale obviously will have cheaper homes due to the distance from the urban cores. We know that the land in urban cores is very valuable and therefore will be a lot more expensive. So the rural periphery will be definitely cheaper, and that lower cost of housing will be attractive to people, especially those that would like to retire. So retirement migration is likely to move to places such as Allerdale. Then there's less traffic congestion and less air pollution. The environment is quieter, more scenic than urban areas. And then there's also a perceived better quality of life due to the factors that we have just mentioned above here. And in 2015, Allerdale was said to have the happiest residents in the UK. So we can see that these benefits that we've talked about have made the residents of Allerdale quite happy about living there. Now, what are the limitations of living in Allerdale, however? So we have an aging population, and this is both due to retirement migration and out-migration of younger people, and this leads to brain drain in these areas. So retirement migration we talked about, there's cheaper housing there, and then due to these pull factors that we've just mentioned as benefits of living in Allerdale, those retirees would like to buy a cheaper house there and enjoy the quieter, more scenic environment that is has less traffic and less congestion and has that perceived better quality of life. Then the younger people, obviously, due to the lack of jobs in such areas, and these areas being remote and far removed from the urban areas, those younger people are likely to want to move out to the areas where they can find higher value jobs. Then low incomes is another problem. So the jobs in these areas tend to be in the primary sector or tourism. Now we know that the primary sector doesn't pay that well. And if we are talking about tourism, tourism is also quite seasonal. So the income from tourism is not necessarily that reliable. And due to this low pay and seasonal work, then it means that these areas are likely to experience rural poverty. Then we are also talking about other problems such as poor public transport due to the remoteness. And due to that remoteness and the unavailability of transport, then it makes any transportation in those areas fairly expensive. Then there is also poor investment from businesses and TNCs, and this is mostly as a result of the low population in these areas. Now we do know that if you want business investment, you will need a larger population, because a larger population will not only provide labor, but will also provide a market for the goods that are being produced or the services that are being offered by those large businesses or TNCs. So as you can see already, there tends to be a significant economic disparity between the urban cores and rural periphery. For the urban cores, we've talked about the fact that London generates almost a quarter of the country's GDP. So there's a lot of wealth in London. And then places like Allerdale, which represent the rural periphery, have seasonal and low paid jobs, which means that in terms of their contribution to the GDP, that contribution is very low, and also those areas or such areas are likely to experience rural poverty. Okay, let's look at the exam style questions for this particular information here. The first one says to state 2 reasons why some people retire to rural areas in the UK. So you can talk about some of these pull factors that we talked about in terms of benefits of living in Allerdale. Explain 1 reason for the regional variations in FDI in 2019. Now, of course, if we are talking about reasons for regional variation in FDI, now FDI is foreign direct investment, and foreign direct investment is normally made by TNCs, as they invest in an area, they are likely to create jobs, and they are also likely to invest in infrastructure. So, for example, telecommunication would be infrastructure that they would want to invest in. If they are a TNC that is investing in call centers, for example. Now, why would they not invest in such areas? Now, they would not invest, obviously, because of the fact that we do not have a very big population. So we do not have a big workforce in areas such as Allerdale. They are experiencing an aging population. So the generation Y that we had talked about earlier, between the 29 and 44-year-old range, is not likely to be as available in these rural areas. So TNCs are not likely to invest that FDI. Then explain two problems facing the rural periphery in the UK. So here again we'll talk about the limitations of some of these limitations here, or two of these limitations here of living in Allerdale. So we have seen that there tends to be economic disparity between the urban cores and the rural periphery. So the government obviously comes up with strategies to try and address this disparity or these differences. And the first strategy that is used is enterprise zones. Now, this involves help with startup costs for companies and businesses, tax cuts, and access to technological infrastructure to incentivize companies to locate in a certain area, and especially in the rural periphery. Now, of course, if you give or you help companies with startup costs, they are likely to be incentivized or to want to go and locate in such places, and especially also if those places are going to have tax breaks, because it means that they will pay a lot less in tax, and therefore their profit is going to be a lot higher. So they are likely to be incentivized to want to locate in these particular areas. The main limitation with this strategy, however, is that only 15 out of the 48 enterprise zones currently in the UK are in rural areas, which then means that the urban cores still benefit a lot more from these enterprise zones. So that economic disparity is not necessarily being addressed as effectively by these enterprise zones. Then the second strategy is transport infrastructure. Now, improving road and rail transport would provide access to remote rural locations. This would in turn attract companies and businesses to locate in these areas, leading to economic growth. Now, obviously, it goes without saying that if you improve the transport infrastructure, places are like those remote places are going to be a lot more accessible. And with that accessibility, then you can attract businesses and TNCs to come in and invest. Now, however, we have a limitation here again, because most of the investment in transport is still around the urban core. So it's not necessarily reaching those remote rural areas. And therefore, it causes those periphery areas to continue to lag behind the urban cores. Then the third strategy here is regional grants. Now, this involves giving advice and partial startup costs to businesses. And these are a lot more widespread in the UK and larger in rural areas. So these are a lot better, obviously, than the enterprise zones, because these cover a lot more of the rural areas, since that is where they are targeting. The limitation, however, is that businesses only get less than 20% of the required startup costs. So they have to put up the 80%, which a lot of businesses may not have or may have to borrow, and therefore start up the business with a lot of debt in hand. Then the last strategy is EU grants. Now, the European Union gives these to the poorest regions in Europe. However, these are no longer available to the UK due to Brexit, because the UK obviously has left the European Union and therefore does not benefit from these EU grants anymore. Okay, let's have a look at the questions that have been asked in the past regarding these strategies. And the first one says, state two strategies that have been used to address the economic disparity between urban core and rural periphery regions in the UK. So you'd state, one of these that we've talked about here. So either enterprise zones, transport infrastructure, or regional grants. Then explain two strategies that have been used to address the economic disparity between the urban core and rural periphery regions. So this particular question here goes beyond the stating part, which was in question 1, and you'd need to explain how they address that economic disparity, or how they aim to address that economic disparity. Then explain two limitations of the strategies that have been used to address this economic disparity. Then again here, you are looking at the limitations that we have discussed and explaining those. The next thing that we're going to look at is the UK's evolving demographic landscape. Now, demography obviously is the study of population, and therefore we are looking at the way the UK's population is changing. Now, the first thing to note is that population normally grows as a result of either natural increase, so where you have more births than deaths, and then it can also grow as a result of migration. So those are the two main reasons. Now, let's begin then with migration. And when talking about migration, it's important for us to discuss net migration. Now, or net immigration. So higher immigration, and immigration is when people move into a country. And then emigration is when people move out of a country. So meaning that net migration or net immigration is the difference between the number of people that enter the country and the number of people that leave the country. Now, we know obviously that emigration, for example, could be of people leaving the UK to go and live in places such as Spain or Portugal or even the USA and so on. And then immigration obviously is when we have people moving into the country. And the difference between the number of people that come in and the number of people that leave is what we are calling the net migration. So we can have a positive net migration, which then means that you have a lot more people coming in than going out, or we may have a negative net migration, which is where you have a lot more people leaving than entering the country. And of course, we know that the UK has got the former, which is where we have a positive net migration. Now, why do people move to the UK, or why do people migrate into the UK? So higher immigration has been linked to the initial expansion of the European Union in 2014. At that time, when the EU expanded the number of countries that were in the Union, people from those countries moved to work and live here in the UK. Now, the other reason why we have people moving into the UK is the need for skilled and specialized workers. Now, these are especially in the knowledge economy. Now, we know that the UK's primary and secondary sector declined, and we are going to be talking about that a little later on. And as a result of that, the tertiary sector and the knowledge economy grew. Now, we know that the knowledge economy requires specialized skills and education, and well, knowledge for that matter. And as a result of that, where there is a shortage of those specialized skills here in the UK, then the UK will aim to get those specialized skills from other parts of the world. And therefore, the UK will allow migrants to come in to take up those jobs. Then the other thing we need to mention here is that the UK government views economic migration as a positive because it mitigates against an aging population. The population of the UK is not growing due to natural increase like it was previously growing before. And as a result, there is an aging population. Now, we know that if there is an aging population, then it means that the number of economically active people is likely to be a lot lower. And as a result of that, the UK government therefore allows for migration to cover those jobs that do not have people to fill them. The second reason for population growth, like we had mentioned earlier, is natural increase. And a large proportion of migrants to the UK are in the economically active category. They therefore have high fertility rates, leading to higher birth rates and higher natural increase. So that basically means that the people who come to work here in the UK tend to be in that economically active age category, the one that we talked about as Generation Y, which is between 29 and 44 years of age, which then means that these people are also in the category that is likely to have children, and that is also leading to a natural increase in the population. So what are the impacts of that immigration then? So one of them is ethnic diversity and multiculturalism, especially in the core regions such as London. And London, for example, has 41% of the population being foreign-born as of 2025. Now, that's quite a significant number in the population that are not born here in the UK. It's almost half. So 40% means that 41% means that 4 out of every 10 people, or 2 out of every 5 people in London is foreign-born. And then the second one here is economic and cultural change. Now, this here is referring to new services such as shops, restaurants, places of worship, music, and so on. And these obviously are to cater for the variety of cultures that now live in the UK. The businesses that are opened up to cater for these people also generate income, adding to the GDP, and also mitigating against the impacts or mitigating against the aging population. Now, we know that when a country does have an aging population, that aging population will rely on the economically active in the country to pay taxes, so that those taxes can then be used to pay their pensions. And therefore, these new businesses that are being created are also useful for those purposes. Then the last thing that we are going to talk about is population density, distribution, and flows. Number one here under that is that there is an increasing population density, obviously, and this is in and around the urban cores, especially London. And in London, we have almost a 1% increase annually. Then the second thing is a rise of commuter towns and villages. Now, these here are the areas that are referred to as accessible rural areas. Now, these accessible rural areas tend to be around the urban cores. So areas that are close to London, for example, that are rural, but that are accessible. So either have very good rail services into London or road networks into London. Those areas are likely to take the overflow of people from London, and especially with the work from home culture, it means that people who would ordinarily work in London can move to those areas and work remotely from home. Then the next thing is retirement migration and counter-urbanization. Now, of course, as the cost of living and house prices continue to increase in urban cores, we tend to have a lot more retirement migration and counter-urbanization taking place. So the people that were previously working in London during their economically active working life tend to retire to rural areas or to areas that are outside those urban cores. And then we also have counter-urbanization as well taking place. So people who find it too expensive to live in London due to the increasing house prices tend to leave London and to go to live in those rural periphery areas, and especially if they can work remotely from home. Then Southeast England, East of England, and East Midlands are growing. Now, these ones are growing quite significantly as more people move further out of London to seek affordable property. Now, that is sort of related to the third point that we've talked about. Then the Southwest, especially Devon and Cornwall, is growing rapidly as more people retire there. So we know that southwestern part of the UK is quite scenic and quite beautiful, and therefore, people would like to retire to, a nice environment, and therefore a lot of the retirement migration is likely to find its way there. And the other thing that we also need to mention here is that the property prices in those areas tend to be a lot lower, obviously, than London. Now, the areas with slower economic growth include Wales and Northern England, and those then lead to the what is referred to as the north-south divide, because we do know, and as we are going to look at later on, that the northern areas of the UK experienced economic decline as the old economy declined here in the UK, and were not necessarily completely able to recover or to recover fully from the decline of the old economy. And as a result, there is an economic divide between the northern part of the UK and the southern part obviously being mostly the southeast, London and the southeast, where most of the GDP is being generated and where most of the wealth is. So that is what is referred to as the north-south divide, if you encounter it in the exam. Okay, let us look at exam style questions for this information here. The first one, study figure 5, which shows ethnic diversity of two regions of England, London and the northeast. Compare the ethnic diversity of London with the northeast. Now, obviously, here you'd be talking about ethnic diversity as a result of immigration into the country. So people moving into the country, because a lot of the migrants are likely to move to the urban cores where most of the jobs are. And then the second question, explain two reasons for regional variations in ethnic diversity. Now that again is a question that is similar to the first one. So we'll be talking about where there is that, why there is that ethnic diversity between regions here in the UK. Now obviously the urban cores having more ethnic diversity compared to the rural periphery areas due to job availability and so on. Then we have number 3, which is to explain two ways in which international migration has changed the population geography of the UK. So we can talk about the fact that there is ethnic diversity and multiculturalism. We could talk about London having 41% of people that are foreign born. We could also talk about the fact that the international migrants that move into the UK tend to be in the economically active category. Which is also the category that is likely to get children, and therefore is going to change the population geography of the UK by causing a natural increase in the population. So we are going to move on then to the decline of the old economy and the Clark-Fisher model. So the Clark-Fisher model shows us how the sectors of employment change in a country as it develops. And it will develop through the pre-industrial stage, then on to the industrial stage, and then finally to the post-industrial stage. Now the UK economy has evolved in a similar way to this particular model. And of course, during the pre-industrial stage, the UK economy was dominated by the primary industry or sector of the economy. And most people worked in fishing, in farming, and in mining. Whatever was produced in these 3 sectors of the economy then needed to be processed or manufactured to get it ready for sale. And this led to the Industrial Revolution of the 1700s and 1800s. And at this time, the UK grew rapidly and prospered from this Industrial Revolution. Of course, by producing goods and selling them across the world. Now, areas like Dinnington in the north of England thrived due to having coal reserves that would be mined and then used for making steel, which would then be used in the engineering industry and for shipbuilding. This was the old economy that greatly relied on the primary and secondary sector of industry here in the UK. However, things changed, and the colliery, for example, in Dinnington closed in 1992 due to declining coal reserves and competition from overseas. The decline of the steel industry then also meant that shipbuilding as well was going to be on the decline. And as a result, we can see that this is what is referred to as a domino effect, where the decline of one particular sector of industry leads to a cascade of consequences in the form of other sectors of industry that are related to it declining as well. Now, all this led to a spiral of decline in Dinnington and other similar areas in the north of the UK. The closure of all these sectors of employment meant loss of jobs, poverty, out-migration, obviously, as people left those areas, abandoned, run-down buildings, and especially the factory buildings, and also the housing that was used by the workers that were now moving out of those areas. And therefore, between 1980 and 2015, the primary industry in the UK was down 45%, so almost half, and the secondary sector was down 43%, again a similar number, and then the tertiary and quaternary sectors were up 59%. Now, clearly, there was a change in the way the UK economy was running, with the primary and secondary sector in decline, and the tertiary and quaternary sectors on the up. So what kind of questions can we get in relation to this information that we have just discussed? And the first question here is to use the Clark-Fisher model to explain how employment changes as a country develops. Now, obviously, here you'd have to describe the changes that take place in the different sectors of industry as as a country develops through the pre-industrial, then to the industrial and the post-industrial sector. Now, for example, and you should use figures. So, for example, if we are talking about the primary sector of industry, that is the largest in the pre-industrial stage, and we can see that it's at over 72%, or at around 72%, if you like. But then it begins to decline as we move, as we go towards the industrial stage. And at the industrial stage, the largest sector of industry, as we can see here, is the secondary or manufacturing sector of industry, which is at around 40%. So you'd go on to describe the changes that are taking place through the various stages of a country's development. Okay, the next question. Explain one impact of globalization on secondary sector employment in the UK. Now, we do know that globalization is what led to competition from overseas, for example. So the cheap steel that was coming to that was being sold worldwide, then meant that the UK steel did not have as much demand on the global stage. So you could talk about competition from overseas here as the point and then explain it. And then the third question is to explain two reasons why the percentage employed in the UK secondary or manufacturing sector has fallen. So here again, we can talk about the declining coal reserves, which meant that the coal that was needed for the steel industry, for example, could no longer be mined, and that obviously meant that the steel industry was affected and had to shut down. So manufacturing of steel could no longer take place. And then we can also talk about competition from overseas as a reason why the UK secondary sector of industry declined. Then the last question here is to calculate the percentage of the population aged 16 and over who were in full-time employment in 2016. Answer to one decimal place and show you're working. So this particular question here obviously is related to the different sectors of employment here in the UK, and this here is a calculate question. So we would need to know how to do that calculation. Now, following the decline of the old economy, there was a rise of the new economy. Now, however, there is a difference in this new economy, because there is the low salary new economy, and then there's also the high salary new economy. Now, when talking about the low salary new economy, we are talking about places such as Dinnington in the north that declined. In an attempt to restore economic activity to these areas, there were initiatives, obviously, to bring tertiary jobs into the area. However, the people who had been working in the mines or in the factories in those northern areas did not have any skills for the new job market that presented itself. So they would have to get new training, for example, which a lot of them did not necessarily do. And therefore, the types of jobs that they then got in the tertiary sector were not necessarily very well paid jobs. Now, as we can see here, some of the jobs that they got include care work jobs, delivery drivers, retail, and work in shopping centers. Now, that obviously implies that the pay that they are going to get in these jobs is not necessarily as high as the pay that people in the knowledge economy, for example, would get. And therefore, this meant that these areas still remained quite poor. the areas where the old economy collapsed. And then the other thing we need to note here is that a lot of the jobs, the new, tertiary sector jobs that were availing themselves were not necessarily all in those particular mining towns, for example, so like Dennington, but they were in the larger surrounding urban centers or towns and cities such as Sheffield, for example. And of course, if somebody from Dennington is going to work in Sheffield, they would need to commute, which meant that they would need to spend more money out of that little income that they are getting on travel, which then makes that a big problem, because now there is what we had referred to earlier as rural poverty. On the contrary, we have the high salary new economy in places such as Canary Wharf. Now, obviously, the people who work in Canary Wharf mostly work in the knowledge economy. And the knowledge economy obviously requires specialized skills and knowledge. So the people who end up working these jobs in the knowledge economy then get very good pay. And obviously, in a lot of the jobs that people do in Canary Wharf, they're likely to be earning over £100,000 a year, which is almost triple the national average. Now, that then means that there is a huge wealth gap or income disparity between these two areas, for example. And then on top of that, the job does not just come with the salary on its own, it comes with other benefits. So these people are likely to have the option to work from home, for example, and therefore their travel costs are going to be less. Their quality of life is likely to be better as well, because they are not doing that commute every single day. They can work from the house. This obviously means that they have flexible working hours and therefore will have a lot less stress. And then in terms of childcare, that is not so much of a problem now, because if they are working from home, they can get to take their children to school before they come back to the house to then settle down to do their work for the day. So this makes for a much better quality of life for people who have this lifestyle. So the main take from here then is that there was a rise in the new economy, but that economy did not benefit everybody equally. There is still disparity between areas in terms of the income that people get and the wealth that those areas generate. Now, what kind of questions are we likely to get based on this information, and which ones have been in past exam papers? And the first one here says to define the term knowledge economy. That we've already defined. That is something now you should be able to do. And then explain one reason for the growth of tertiary employment in the UK. So you can talk about, the decline of the old economy here in the UK, which then necessitated the growth of a new economy, and that new economy involved the tertiary sector of industry. Then explain two reasons for the economic disparity in two regions of the UK. So here you can talk about some of these reasons that we have discussed here. So in terms of salary, in terms of benefits, and so on. And then the next question here says to explain why median income is a better measure than mean income when comparing places. Now, for this particular question, this is what the mark scheme says. The mean is distorted by extreme values, because of course, if you have a mean, then you could have some values that are really high and then others that are really, really low. So the mean then, when you take an average, obviously, which is the mean of those scores, it could mean that that average is not accurate, and therefore the median, so the middle number, is likely to give you a better idea of the situation because it's the middle number, other than adding everything up and coming up with and calculating an average. Okay, so the next question is to explain one benefit of working in the quaternary sector of the economy. Now, of course, here we are talking about better pay. We are talking about the work from home culture, which allows people to have more flexible working hours, to be able to care for their children and not have to pay for childcare, for example, to have less stress and so on. So the points that we have discussed under the high salary new economy. Okay, the next thing that our specification requires us to know is the impact of globalization, TNCs, and FDI here in the UK. Now, of course, it's important for us to define those three before we carry on. And the first one is globalization. And this is a process by which countries around the world are becoming increasingly interconnected through trade, technology, transport, migration, and communication. Then a transnational corporation, or TNC, is a company or an organization that has operations in more than one country. So it's operating in more than one country. So Apple is an example, Nike is an example. So these companies are American companies, but are found almost everywhere across the globe. Then foreign direct investment, or FDI, is the money that is invested mostly by TNC. So it's money that is coming from outside the country. So for example, Apple has invested in factories in China, for example. So those factories that Apple have built in China are a form of FDIs, because it's the investment that is being made in China by a foreign company, which is Apple from America. Okay, then we also have another key term actually here that we need to mention, and that is privatization. And privatization is where state or government-owned businesses or infrastructure are sold to private TNCs. Now, an example here, which is a controversial one, that would be would be like the NHS. So selling the NHS obviously to a TNC or to a different organization, then would mean that it has been privatized. At the moment, it's a national or state-owned organization. So having discussed those definitions, it's important for us to note that globalization, TNCs, and FDI are obviously interconnected, because if we are talking about globalization being, the increasing interconnectedness between countries through trade, migration, communication, and so on, then it means that that is what leads to TNCs growing across the globe. Because without that global network of trade, for example, which has been facilitated by containerization, then TNCs would not be able to locate globally and then be able to ship their goods globally as well, or worldwide if you like. So globalization has facilitated those TNCs or the growth of TNCs. And of course, with those TNCs growing, it means that FDI is going to be invested in different parts of the world. So we are then going to look at the impacts of the positive impacts of globalization and FDI, as well as the negative impacts here in the UK. And of course, we are talking about them as though they were the same thing, because they are interconnected. So what are the positive impacts of globalization and FDI in the UK then? So one is job creation, obviously. The second one is economic growth, because as those jobs are created by TNCs, they are going to provide the government with tax revenue, and then that tax revenue is going to be used to invest in infrastructure, and then the people who have been employed will also require services, and because they require services, more jobs are going to be created, and that will lead to a positive multiplier effect. And then the third thing here is a greater choice for consumers. Now, this is referring to a choice of goods and services that are available for consumers, which is a positive thing, because as TNCs invest, then it means that the variety of goods that are going to be available globally is going to be a lot more. Then we are talking about infrastructure improvements. Obviously, if a TNC is setting up, say they are setting up a call center, they are going to ensure that the telecommunication services or infrastructure in that particular country or in that particular area where they are investing are quite good, and therefore they will invest in those telecommunication services, which will then mean that the infrastructure in that country is going to improve. Then there's going to be technology, new technology coming into the country, and then skills as well. Those TNCs are likely to invest in the skills of the people that are going to work for them, so they are likely to train them. So there will be new training which will bring new skills into the country. Then there's also likely to be cultural diversity, because there will be people there will be people that are moving or migrating to different places to take up these jobs. So that multiculturalism and ethnic diversity is going to be propagated by that as well. Then if we are talking about negative impacts of globalization and FDI, one of them is deindustrialization. So deindustrialization obviously being the shutting down of factories in mostly in the richer countries. And we know that that happened with the decline of the old economy here in the UK, for example, and in the US. So in the USA, places like Detroit declined as a result of the global shift, which then led to that deindustrialization where the factories had to shut down. So, and I think that I believe that was a question in the 2025 paper. The students were asked to talk about what deindustrialization is. And then the other thing is uneven development. So you will find that the areas in a country, for example, where there has been a lot of FDI, so a lot of investment from overseas, those areas are likely to thrive, and then the areas that don't have the investment are likely to be left quite poor. So there's going to be economic disparity between areas in line with the amount of investment that has been made by foreign organizations or foreign entities. Okay, then the next one is environmental problems. Now we know obviously as factories are opened up in places, there is likely to be air and water pollution. Then we have profit leakage. So this means that not all the profit that is made by TNCs will remain in the countries where that money is being made. So a lot of those profits are likely to be repatriated. So repatriated meaning they are likely to be sent back to the home country. So the country where the FDI is being generated, or where the country where the income is being generated is not going to benefit fully from the money that is being generated in it. And then we are talking about pressure on local businesses. Now, of course, as you have more businesses coming into the country and a wider variety or range of products, then it means that the businesses that are native to that country are likely to suffer because of competition. This competition from overseas is likely to drive them out of business or to cause them to have a much less market share in the goods and services that they are selling to the market. And then job insecurity is another problem because some jobs are likely to be outsourced to countries where labor is a lot cheaper. Okay, so we have a case study here, and this is a case study of Nissan in Sunderland. Now, what's the background then? So Nissan, a Japanese car manufacturer, opened a large car manufacturing plant in Sunderland in 1986. So what positive impacts did this have? So it created over 7,000 jobs, and then there were thousands of other jobs created indirectly in supply companies. Then increased local income. So obviously Sunderland is an area in the northern part of the UK, which means it's one of the areas that suffered the decline of the old economy. So by opening a factory here, the local incomes that had greatly reduced due to that decline of the old economy can now begin to recover. So people can now have increased incomes. And then we have improved transport links as well. Of course, if you're locating a factory in this particular area, you're going to have to ensure that the infrastructure that is required for this factory to be able to operate effectively are put in place. And these include roads and other telecommunication facilities as well. Then it encouraged other investment into the region. Now, of course, if you have a big company in an area, that is likely to attract other bigger companies to come and locate there. Then in terms of negative impacts, there is dependence on one major employer, which then means that if that employer decides either to shut down or to reduce on the number of people that they employ. So for example, if they had a lot more mechanization or use of AI, for example, that we are talking about currently as a global issue, then it would mean that the people who are reliant on jobs from these this one manufacturer are likely to suffer job losses. And then the other thing that is a negative here is traffic and pollution around the factories. Now, obviously, because there's a lot of activity around the factory, there's likely to be a lot more traffic in the area, which leads to congestion, which then leads to air pollution. And then we have vulnerable to global economic changes. Now, global economic changes here include things like global slowdowns. Now, if there's a global slowdown, especially that impacts on the car market, for example, then that will mean that the number of cars that the Nissan is selling across the world is going to go down. So they will have to reduce on their manufacturing. And whenever there is a reduction in manufacturing, it may also come along with job losses. So that's another variable in the situation. Okay, let's look at some of the questions that have been asked previously and others that are likely to be asked based on this information. And the first one is to explain 2 reasons why transnational corporations have become more important to the UK economy. Now, of course, I would be talking about the fact that they're important because they are bringing jobs, and especially in areas where the old economy declined. So by bringing those jobs, they are bringing in the multiplier effect in those areas, and they are also investing in infrastructure. So these positive impacts that we've talked about here are what you would be talking about for this particular question here. And then explain 2 ways in which TNCs have changed the economy of the UK. Now, again, you're talking about the points that we have discussed here, both positive and some of the negatives maybe could be points that you could talk about. And then study figure 3, which shows the amount of foreign direct investment in billions of pounds into regions of the UK for 2015 and 2019. Identify the region with the smallest increase in FDI between 2015 and 2019. Now, this was a 1-mark question, but obviously it's talking about FDI, so I put it here just for you to see what kind of questions could be asked. And then calculate the percentage increase in FDI into the London region. Answer to 1 decimal place. Now, again, this is a calculate question. Now, in paper 2, you are likely to get a lot of these calculate questions. So some of them are likely to ask you, say, for the difference or the percentage, to calculate the percentage or percentage increase or percentage decrease. And then you could also be asked to calculate the mean, the median, and so on. So it's important for you to be prepared to answer those calculate questions as well. Then the last question here says to compare the importance of London in attracting FDI with the rest of the UK. Now, of course, here you'd be talking about the fact that London has a huge population, which then means that FDI is going to be, or TNCs are going to be attracted to London and will bring FDI with them because there is a huge pool of workers, first of all, and then there is also a huge market for any goods that are likely and services that are likely to be produced by those TNCs. And then you could also talk about the fact that London is quite accessible. Now, of course, we did talk about London earlier, and we talked about the road networks, we talked about the rail networks, nationally. And also we talked about regionally, the fact that there are links to Europe. There's a Eurostar, for example, and the Channel Tunnel and so on. And then internationally, London has 4 major airports. So again, that accessibility and interconnectivity of London is very good. So you can talk about those in that particular question there. So the next thing that we are going to talk about is London's location and its significance, and especially with relation to its site and its situation. Those are 2 very important keywords that our specification requires us to know about. Now, when talking about the site, we are mostly talking about the early site factors that were looked at by the Romans before they established the settlement in Londinium in 200 AD. So what were those early site factors? And one of them is that it's on a floodplain. So a floodplain, obviously, meaning the area around a river that is likely to flood when that river bursts its banks. Now, of course, when we are talking about a floodplain, it's likely to be a flat area or piece of land, which then implies that it's easy to build on and therefore very ideal for a settlement. Now, the second site factor that the Romans looked at was a bridging point. Now, this is an area on the an area in the river that is shallow enough to facilitate crossing from the northern part of London, in this particular case, to the southern part of London. Now, of course, that was very important for trade purposes and just for accessibility and movement. So you can see here, for example, you can see here that the bridging point was established here. And of course, London grew outwards from here, as you can see. Then the next thing was a water source. Now, obviously, the River Thames provided that, a water source, because we know that humans will need water for their domestic purposes, for their cooking, and of course, for the industry that was to develop later on. And then lastly, we have navigation. So navigation meaning a mode of transport or a way of transporting goods in and out of London. Now we know that the River Thames obviously was very handy for that. And then obviously it leads to the sea, and then goods can be transported internationally from there. And therefore the settlement was built in Londinium, and London began to expand from there. Now, what about situation then? So situation refers to the location of a settlement in relation to other physical and human features that are around it. Now, of course, London's location is ideal nationally, regionally, and internationally. Now, when we are talking about nationally, so the UK's fastest rail services link London to the major cities. Now we know that we can travel from London to any of the major cities here in the UK, and people in those major cities can also travel to London. So that makes London very accessible. And then we also have a national road network that seems to to have its center in London. So we have a system of radial roads, and then on top of that we have motorways, obviously, that tend to lead towards London. Then we have A roads and B roads. So most of these allow London to be very accessible. So it's like spokes of a wheel, obviously, with London being the center or the hub, and then the transportation network then growing or expanding from there to other parts of the country. So London is the hub. And then regionally, London is actually quite close to mainland Europe, and this facilitated growth in trade through the Industrial Revolution. And then we mentioned in the last slide the Eurostar, which makes Europe quite accessible, in the Channel Tunnel and so on. So, and then the fact that, London has 4 major airports, that also provides access into Europe. And also the third point here, internationally, those 4 airports also provide accessibility to and from London internationally as well. So not just to Europe, but to other parts of the world. But internationally, that's not the only thing. We are also talking about the time zone. So London's time zone is very, very ideal for trading with other parts of the world. So if we are talking about the New York Stock Exchange, for example, they are only 5 hours behind. And then if we are talking about Asia, Asia is 5 to 7 hours behind, and then UAE is 4 hours ahead. So that then means that if you're trading with these other parts of the world from London, then it's easy to do so because the time zone allows for that to be possible. Now, we also do know that in terms of stock exchanges, the London Stock Exchange is one of the ones that is known globally. And then New York Stock Exchange is also a big one. So in terms of generating revenue, those stock exchanges do generate a lot of money. And we did mention that that London is a global city, and a global city meaning one that has influence economically and politically. And of course, if you have a stock exchange as large as the London Stock Exchange, that means that economic influence globally is enhanced. Okay, so what kind of questions would we be asked then with regards to this information? The first one here, for a UK city you have studied, explain the importance of its site and situation for its growth and development. Now, this was an actual exam question, and that was worth 4 marks. So, of course, you were to talk about the site and then talk about the situation and how that has helped with the growth and development of London. So in terms of site factors, you talk about the ones that we've mentioned here and how those facilitated the growth of London. And then in terms of site or situation rather, so London's location in relation to physical and human features around it, then you talk about either one of these three here and explain how that has helped London to grow and to develop. Then the next question is to explain two reasons why London has experienced rapid economic growth. Now, again, you can talk about these points here, and especially the ones that have to do with the situation, because they have definitely helped rapid economic growth of London, like the time zone, for example. The next thing that we'll talk about is London's structure. Now, we have the Burgess model here. And the Burgess model is a geographical model that has been used to explain how land use develops in an urban area. Now, Burgess suggested that a settlement grows from a central point, and that central point is a CBD, and then grows outwards in concentric rings, as you can see in this particular figure here. Now, London's structure can be explained to some extent using the Burgess model, although it does not exactly fit the model. But of course, knowing the model is good background information. So what does London's structure include? So we have a CBD, or the CBD here in London. Now, London's Central Business District is the oldest part of the city, of course, and is the economic hub. So most of the economic activity is actually taking place. So it has tall office buildings. Now, in the last slide, we mentioned the London Stock Exchange. You're likely to find, stock traders and other, organizations such as JP Morgan. Okay, JP Morgan would be in Canary Wharf, but the CBD, which is one of the areas where the CBD has expanded to. And of course, we have other high-flying organizations that are within the CBD. So that CBD also has great accessibility. It has high building density. Now, high building density, obviously, because there is demand for that office space or office flow. Now, obviously, a lot of organizations and companies would like to locate in company because that is where the economic activity is at its most, and that is where most of the money would be made. And therefore, that high building density is as a result of the demand for land and for office space, and that then causes the land values in London to be quite high as well, because if there is demand for something, then that means that there is a short supply, and therefore that drives the price up. So London CBD has expanded to include London's West End. So this one here has theatres and shopping, and then Canary Wharf, which we have just mentioned, which has the knowledge economy. Then the second part of the structure is the inner suburbs. So London has both affluent inner suburbs. Those include Kensington, for example, and areas that are lower income. So an example here being Hackney. But Hackney, for example, and other similar areas are experiencing change through regeneration and gentrification. And the latter are industrial areas of the Industrial Revolution. Now, for a lot of us, or for a lot of students doing their GCSE, they are likely to have gone to, the ones that are close to London are likely to have gone to Stratford, which is an area that has experienced regeneration and gentrification. So it's an example of an area similar to Hackney. The third part of the structure is a rural-urban fringe, and this is where the city meets the countryside. And these areas have grown due to London's urban sprawl. So urban sprawl meaning that London is expanding outwards, rising housing costs. Now, of course, as the housing cost increases in London, then people are likely to move out of London into the peripheral areas or the areas surrounding London or in that rural urban fringe. And then as a result of work from home culture as well. So meaning that people do not necessarily have to travel to London to work, but can work remotely from home, which then means that they can live further away from London, but still work in London, if you like. Okay, then we are going then to talk about this second figure here, and this one here is showing the land values here in London, and this is also really important because it's something that is likely to be asked about in the exam. So due to high demand, the land values around the CBD obviously are high, as we have mentioned, and only the larger, wealthier companies and large retail chains can afford to pay the high rental costs here. There is also limited land due to the building density. We talked about that, and therefore if we are developing or building, we are going to build upwards other than outwards, obviously to save on space. And then the other thing that is very important for us to mention here is that the land values decrease as you move away from the CBD. The only anomaly or exception to that is where you have intersections of major roads, and in such areas you tend to have higher land values than would be expected in the fringe areas. So for example, you've got Brent Cross here where there's a large intersection, and that area does have high land values, and you can see there are others around the CBD. So those are areas where you have intersections that are likely to have slightly higher values than would be expected. Okay, so let's have a look at a number of exam style questions that would be asked here. And the first one is to identify one piece of evidence that this is in the central business district of Manchester. Now that was an image that was provided. Now of course that image had tall buildings, and then that obviously is a piece of evidence. It also had a tram, and it also had a park where people could sit and relax. So those were pieces of evidence that could be used to show that that is a CBD, or is the CBD of Manchester in this particular instance. Then identify the most likely function of buildings which are under 10 meters in height. Now, if a building is under 10 meters in height, then it's likely to be a two-story building. So the land use there then would be residential. Now we have not mentioned the land uses here because we can talk about commercial or retail land use, we can talk about industrial land use, and then we also have residential land use. So those are the land uses that we could be talking about in an exam situation. Then the next question is to explain one reason why building height varies in urban areas. Now, of course, we did talk about the high land values in the CBD, and we said that they build upwards other than outwards because there is limited space, and there is also a large or a huge demand for office space. So that is something you could talk about there. And then the next one, for a UK city you have studied, explain the differences between the land use in the central business district and the urban rural fringe, or the rural urban fringe if you like. Now, of course, here we'd be talking about the central business district having a lot more commercial and retail land use. And then the rural urban fringe is likely to be more residential. Although having said that, some of the areas in the rural urban fringe are also likely to have out-of-town shopping centers close by, and also retail parks because there is a space for it. And then they are also likely to have some industrial estates as well. Then the fifth question, for a named UK city, explain two reasons why the functions of its inner city have changed in the recent years. So here you're talking about what those inner city areas were used for previously, so their functions. And of course, if we are talking about inner city areas such as Stratford, they were used for industry initially, during the Industrial Revolution, but that function has changed. It has changed because of global shift, and there's a lot more retail now. So that's one change that has taken place. And then the other thing you could talk about here is decentralization. Now, decentralization here refers to businesses moving out of an area such as those inner city areas. So due to global shift and deindustrialization, a lot of businesses actually chose to move out of those inner city areas, and a lot of them, some of them relocated to the rural urban fringe, where there was a lot more space and where the accessibility was also quite good. So you can talk about that as another changing function of those inner city areas. The next thing our specification requires us to know is the causes and impacts of migration to London. Now, the growth of London is as a result of two types of migration. We have national or internal migration. And this is mostly migration of recent graduates from UK universities. So students that have graduated from different universities in different parts of the country move to London to find jobs, because most of the jobs are obviously in and around London. And also they would like to enjoy other benefits, such as the good healthcare facilities that are in London, the good entertainment facilities that are in London, and generally a better quality of life, so to speak. And then the second type of migration is international or overseas migration. Now, this has two categories of people that come to work in London. And the first one here is of skilled workers. And these are the workers that are well educated and have specialized skills. Now, these workers are likely to work in the knowledge economy or in other sectors of the economy where there are shortages. So we do know, for example, that recently the UK government was looking to recruit doctors and nurses from different parts of the world, because they were not the number that were being produced here locally in local universities was not enough to cover the numbers that were required. And then we also have unskilled workers. And these are the workers that tend to do the jobs that a lot of Londoners would not want to do. An example of that being garbage collection, for example. And the new migrants that arrive will want to find areas that have lower rents, and therefore will tend to cluster in similar areas, and especially where there are people of a similar ethnicity. Now, why is this? This is so that they can preserve their culture, and then also be protected from discrimination, and then have access to services that are available in their home countries. So in those areas where they have clustered, they tend to have places of worship, for example, that they would find in their home countries. They would also have shops and restaurants that cater to the types of diets that they have in their home countries, and therefore they feel a lot more comfortable living in these places. So this has modified London's demographic landscape, or the way London's population looks. The diversity and multiculturalism that has been added by the overseas or international migration. Now, this map here is an example of that clustering in London, and it shows the percentage of Asian, Indian, British residents here in London. It shows that the distribution is not evenly spread, as you can see, because if you look at the key here, the highest percentages are found in the areas that have a dark shade of purple or blue. That looks a lot more purplish. So that dark color there is where you have the highest percentages, with over 37%. And then you can see it reduces as you go up this particular key here. But then you can actually see that the concentration is around this area here. So the west of London, so places like Hounslow, Southall, Wembley and Harrow. And then you have an anomaly here, which is Newham in East London. So they are mostly found in West London. And then there's this anomaly here in Newham. But then their distribution across London is uneven, because there are areas where they are not as many. Now, this actually is a similar situation for other ethnic groups as well here in the UK. They tend to cluster in similar areas. Now, what are questions that are likely to be asked based on this information here? So for a UK city you have studied, explain 2 ways in which international migration has influenced its growth and character. So you can talk about areas that have grown as a result of this migration, international migration. You can talk about the character of London. So London's character has changed because it has more diversity, ethnic diversity, and is also quite multicultural. So you can talk about or discuss those 2 points here. And then for the second question, for a named UK city, explain one way in which migration has changed its population. So again, you'd be talking about the multiculturalism that has taken place and the ethnic diversity that has taken place. And you would talk about the clustering of different ethnic groups in certain areas of London and so on. The next thing that we are going to look at is the IMD and London's inequalities. So London, as we said previously, is a world city, one that has economic and political influence globally. And we also did say that it generates a quarter of the UK's GDP, and therefore there is a lot of wealth in London. However, it was estimated in 2022, between 2022 and 2023, that 2.2 million Londoners, which is 24%, live in poverty. So this is actually 3%. So the 24% is 3% higher than the rest of the UK, which implies that the richest and the poorest people in the UK live in London. There is therefore significant inequality in the city, with different standards of living and different life expectancy for different Londoners. Some parts of London have high levels of deprivation, while others do not. And deprivation refers to a lack of wealth and services. The government uses 7 indicators to produce an index of multiple deprivation. And those indicators are income, education, employment, health and disability, access to housing, crime, and living environment. And as far as our specification is concerned, we should look at 2 areas that are contrasting in nature, and those 2 areas are Newham and Richmond. Now, Richmond being one of the wealthiest, and then Newham being the poorest borough here in London. Now, when we look at those indicators, so we are going to look at some of those indicators here, and we have Newham obviously here, and then we have Richmond, and then we have the IMD indicators up here. Now, in terms of income, the income in Newham, the average income is 24,162, while in Richmond it's 90,400. So in Richmond, it's more than 3 times that of Newham. So we can already see that there is an income disparity, which then implies obviously that there is going to be a disparity in terms of the quality of life or standard of living. Then we have crime. So crime here is measured per 1,000. And in Newham, it's 113 per 1,000. Richmond is 156 per 1,000. So in Richmond, it's half that of Newham. Then life expectancy. The average life expectancy in Richmond is 71.2, and then in Newham it's 57.4, which is quite a drastic difference. Then we have unemployment, and this was in 2023, so 7.9% unemployed in Newham and 4.5% unemployed in Richmond. Then free school meals, and this is one that the examiners like to ask about in the exam, or have asked about it in previous papers anyway. And the children on free school meals in Newham is 39%, which is almost 3 times that of Richmond, which is at 13.5%. Then we have, owner-occupier housing, so where people own their own homes. And in Newham, the percentage is obviously a lot less, so it's at 30.8%, and then in Richmond, it's 48.2%. Now, exam style questions. The first one is to identify which one of the following London's boroughs has the highest GCSE scores. So this was a question that had a figure that had GCSE scores, and all you had to do was to identify the one with the highest. Then, of course, that is related to free school meals as well, because that has an implication on performance in school as well. Then we have state a relationship between child poverty and GCSE scores that could be investigated. Now, I believe that was the same paper. So when talking about child poverty, you could be talking about the fact that that has an implication on GCSE scores, because child poverty is likely to lead to a situation where the child does not necessarily have the facilities or equipment that they need in school to be able to facilitate that good performance. And then also, we could be talking about issues such as even getting to school, which would imply, for example, that you may end up with, attendance also being a problem. And of course, we know that attendance would affect the GCSE scores. So that is a relationship that could be investigated according to this question here. And then number 3, explain one reason why child poverty varies between different parts of a city. So you can talk about the deprivation. So you can talk about the income of different, the income in different parts of a city. So some areas have higher income and therefore will have less child poverty, and then others will have lower income and therefore are likely to have more, child poverty. Then the last one is, for a UK city that you have studied, explain 2 reasons why there are contrasting levels of inequality in different parts of the city. Then, of course, this one again, you can talk about some of the issues that we have discussed here. The next thing that our specification requires us to know is London's past cycle of decline. Now, I've divided it into 5 main sections here, and we are going to talk through them. And the first one is containerization. Now, containerization obviously is the use of large standard containers to transport and ship goods across the world. Now, of course, when containerization was initially introduced, it made transportation of goods around the world a lot cheaper and a lot faster, and that allowed for globalization to take place, where companies now did not necessarily need to locate close to the raw materials or close to the markets where they were selling the products, but instead they could locate anywhere in the world and be able to bring the raw materials in and then be able to distribute the products across the world wherever they want. So it started in 1956, and this meant that large container ships could not be able to navigate through the River Thames, because for the container ships were a lot bigger than the ships that were there before. So the River Thames obviously is a river, it's not the sea, it's not the ocean, and therefore it became a little too narrow and too shallow for these large container ships, and as a result, the London Docklands actually shut down or closed in 1981. Now, as you can imagine, that then led to the second point here, which is deindustrialization. Now, of course, with the docks closing, it meant that any raw materials that were being brought in to the industries in the around the docklands could no longer be brought in. And then, of course, because there was no manufacturing of goods, there were no goods obviously to be taken out, and they could not be taken out to market anyway because the container ships were now too big, which then meant that deindustrialization took place. So the industries that were there shut down and they moved or relocated to other places, and especially a lot of them actually especially moved abroad, where they could where the manufacturing costs were a lot less. So that then led to mass unemployment in London, and in 2001 only 7.5% worked in manufacturing compared to 30% in 1971. So as we can see there, manufacturing really suffered during that time. And of course, this here can be linked to the old economy, which relied heavily on the primary and secondary sector of industry. And in this particular case or instance, the secondary or manufacturing sector of industry. Then we have number 3 here, which is suburbanization. Now we know that suburbanization is when people move from inner city areas to the suburbs. Now, of course, for the people who had the ability to move, so the ones who were a little wealthier, that had lived in the inner city for a long time, were now not very happy with the way the inner city was like, because with the deindustrialization then came abandoned buildings, then there was and abandoned housing, And then we are also talking about, vandalization of these old buildings that were no longer in use. And then obviously crime shot up because people did not have jobs. And of course, there was congestion as well in these areas. And as a result of all these problems, or what we could refer to as push factors, then the people that were wealthy enough decided to move away from these inner city areas to the suburbs. So that is suburbanization. And 1.5 million people moved to the suburbs. Now that is quite a huge proportion of the population of London at the time. And of course, that was facilitated, or that move was facilitated by the London Underground and electrification of the train networks here in the UK, because it then meant that they could live in the suburbs and still be able to commute into London to work, as in central London to work. And then the next one here is decentralization. As deindustrialization occurs and job losses occur, then it means that people do not have money to spend, which then means that businesses and organizations that were once based in the inner city are likely to move away from the inner city. And this is what happened, and that is what we call decentralization, when shops, offices, and people and industry move from urban areas to the suburbs or to the periphery. And of course, this was catalyzed by out-of-town shopping centers, retail parks, which were outside, which were mostly in the rural urban fringe, and business parks, and also e-commerce, where there was now online shopping other than physical shops where people needed to go and shop. Then we have finally number 5 here, resurgence. Now, after the decline of London, there was obviously an attempt to try and bring London back into play, or to try and improve the situation in London. And London fought back against this loss of business and built shopping centers to attract people back to spend money in London. And an example, or examples rather, Westfield Shopping Centre in Stratford, and a second example is a shopping centre in Shepherd's Bush in West London. Okay, so what kind of questions are likely to be asked with regards to this information here? And the first one, for a named UK city, explain 2 reasons why the functions of its inner city areas have changed in recent years. Now, of course, we are talking about one of the functions being an industrial function, which changed due to globalization and containerization. And then we are also talking about the decentralization that took place, meaning that shops and businesses and offices and industry moved out of those inner city areas to the rural urban fringe, and as a result the function changed. Then for a UK city you have studied, explain why some parts of the city have experienced decline. So here you are talking about containerization and deindustrialization. And then for a named UK city, explain 2 reasons why some parts of the city have high levels of inequality. Now, of course, we also do know, and we shall look at later on, that some parts of the city have experienced resurgence. So they have been regenerated, or shopping centers, for example, have been built, and that obviously has brought some money back into those areas. But then we also do know that there are some areas where that has not happened. And as a result of that, there's likely to be disparity in terms of income, which then leads to the inequality that is being asked about here. Then the last question is, for a UK city you've studied, explain 2 reasons why some parts of this city have experienced decline. So again here, this is similar to one of the questions we talked about earlier, and that is as a result of deindustrialization and decentralization. The next thing that we shall look at is London's urban sprawl and regeneration. Now, despite losing 1.5 million people between 1951 and 1981, London has continued to grow in size. And these are some of the reasons here. And the first one is counter-urbanization. And this has been in the form of people moving out of the city to live in the home counties, making London a conurbation, meaning that the boundary between city and country is actually now blurred. And London now merges with the surrounding countryside, and those areas become part of Greater London. Then we have suburbanization as well, and the people moving to the suburbs live in bigger housing with a garden occupying a lot more space, which then has a big implication on urban sprawl, because a lot more land is now being taken up to accommodate the population of London. Then we have number 3, the baby boom after the Second World War. So after the war, people had a lot more children, and the fertility rates in 1948 were 2.8, which is fairly high. And this implied that when these people now grew up and started their families in the 1960s, then they needed a lot more room. And of course, needing a lot more room then implies that a lot more building had to take place, which then led to urban sprawl here in London. And then the last one is increasing divorce and later marriage. Now, of course, this then means that a lot more housing is needed, because if there's a divorce in a family, then it means that there will be 2 separate households other than just one, which then leads to a demand for more housing. And then if we are talking about later marriages, as we know is happening currently, then it means that people are staying on their own for a lot longer, which then also increases the demand for housing. And as that housing is built, then that leads to urban sprawl. The next thing that we are going to talk about is urban resurgence. So apart from London's occupied land area increasing, the city has also regrown. So it's not just the surface area, so to speak, of London that has increased, but within the city itself, there has been growth. And this has been due to the following processes. And the first one is regeneration. And this has been as a result of the availability of brownfield land. So land that became disused after the deindustrialization process. So there were a lot of abandoned buildings, whether those be factory buildings or housing, and those needed to be knocked down and regenerated. Now that provided an opportunity for new buildings, whether that be in the form of housing or shopping centers or other infrastructure within these areas. And obviously it provided an opportunity to rebuild afresh and to have a lot more planning and thought put into the infrastructure and buildings that were going to come up. And that has caused resurgence of London. And with that happening, obviously, and especially with shopping centers, we then have a lot of employment coming into play and a positive multiplier effect in a lot of these areas. Now, of course, when talking about infrastructure development, it's important for us to note that TNCs are also likely to be attracted to these newly developed areas because the infrastructure is going to be there. For example, if we are talking about Stratford and its redevelopment, we know that the rail networks are really good. So in terms of TNCs and other businesses coming to invest, and especially in the knowledge economy, then it means that it will provide an opportunity for these areas to resurge. Now, for example, we have Canary Wharf, which has companies such as JP Morgan, Credit Suisse, and so on. Now, these obviously represent high-value businesses that pay very well, which then implies that you're likely to get gentrification in these areas as well, where you are attracting a wealthier demographic to live in the area, and again, leading to that positive multiplier effect. Then that actually is a third point, which is gentrification. And gentrification here, the example that has been given is East Village in Stratford. Now, this is in reference to the accommodation in East Village, because the Olympic Village, which housed the Olympians during the 2012 Olympics, was converted into housing. This is high value, expensive accommodation that attracts wealthier people to live in the area, which then leads to gentrification. So you have attracted wealthier people into the area, and in so doing, they are going to be spending their income in that particular area, creating that positive multiplier effect. Then the last thing here we shall discuss is studentification. Now this as well has increased, and studentification here has to do with the number of students that live in the area. Now we obviously have the University of East London in this particular area, and it obviously will attract both local citizens, local students, so students from within the UK, as well as overseas or international students. Now, we do know also that students require accommodation, and by there being an increase in the demand for accommodation, then it means that these areas are going to resurge, because there will be a lot more regeneration taking place so as to provide this housing. And we also do know that these students are going to be spending money in those areas, which again is going to lead to a positive multiplier effect. Okay, so let's have a look at a number of questions here that have to do with London's urban sprawl and regeneration. And the first one is, for a named UK city, explain one reason why regeneration can have negative impacts on some people. Now, of course, if we are talking about regeneration having a negative impact, I would be talking about some of the locals being priced out of the housing market, for example. So if an area has been regenerated and gentrification takes place, then it means that the value of housing in that particular area is likely to go up. And as the value of housing goes up, then it means that the affordability, especially for people within income groups that may not have experienced change in an income, is going to be affected. And then in terms of the local services that will now cater to this new population that has come into the area, it will also imply that the services are likely to be a little more expensive, which again may pose affordability problems to the population that has lived there for a lot longer. So these are issues that you can discuss for that particular question. Then we have, for a UK city you have studied, explain one reason why some parts of the city have experienced growth. So you can talk about regeneration, you can talk about TNC investment. So these reasons here we gave for urban resurgence are reasons that you can talk about here. Then for a UK city you have studied, explain one negative impact and one positive impact of regeneration on local people. So again, we have discussed that. And then lastly, for a UK city you have studied, explain one positive and one negative effect of regeneration. So again, that is very similar to the third question, only that this time round is not talking about local people specifically, but requires a more general response. The next thing that our specification requires us to know about is the strategies that have been used to make London more sustainable. Now we are going to start off with strategy number 1, which is improvements to transport. And these ones here will include congestion charging, ULEZ, hybrid buses, and provision of more electric charging points. Now, all of these aim at improving London's air quality by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Now, if we can briefly talk about a couple of these, if we talk about congestion charging and ULEZ, so congestion charging, first of all, it's a charge that is levied on cars that go into the CBD of London, so areas that are within the CBD. So that is to reduce the number of cars that are going into that CBD or into the CBD of London. Now, by doing that, obviously, that they are dissuading or discouraging motorists from driving into London and instead take public transport. So that is a good way of reducing on air pollution and improving the air quality in London. And then if we are talking about ULEZ, so the ULEZ stands for the ultra low emission zone. So that is the area that is within the M25. So is London CBD obviously, and the outer part, the outer parts of London. So it goes all the way up to the M25. So it's a wider area, and to be able to go into that area without paying a charge, you would need either an electric car or a car that is low emitting, where the emissions that it's producing is concerned. At the moment, the cars that are allowed are within the category that is Euro 6 and above if they are diesel, and I believe Euro 4 or above if it's a petrol car. Now, obviously, again, that will reduce on the number of high emitting cars or traffic that is likely to come into London, and therefore improve the air quality. So it's improving sustainability within London. And then we also have the hybrid buses. Now, obviously, those ones use both electric and fuel, and therefore they are low emitting. And then we also have, being introduced more recently, fully electric vehicle, buses, which are not going to emit any pollution at all. Then the next strategy that we are going to talk about here is the work from home culture. Now, of course, if more people are working from home, then it will reduce the need to travel to work. And of course, as that need to travel to work is reduced, then it means that the greenhouse gas emissions are also going to be decreased. And of course, we are also talking about a better quality of life for the people who are working from home, because as we had said previously, that it reduces on that stress of travel every day, of commuting, and also gives people a lot more flexibility with their working hours and with their childcare costs. Then we have affordable housing as the third strategy here. And there are several schemes. Now, we did mention when talking about regeneration, that regeneration can lead to house prices going up in an area and pricing out the local residents. Now, the house prices in London obviously have continued to increase due to the increased demand as the population of London increases. And as a result of that, the government has sought to come up with housing that is a lot more affordable. So schemes such as First Steps will help low-income Londoners to buy property through shared ownership schemes, which is where people will be allowed to buy maybe either 50% or 40% of a property and then pay the rest in rent. And then as they continue to work and as their pay continues to increase, then they can, buy a bigger share of that property as they go along, and then eventually, hopefully at some point, be able to own the property fully. However, having said that, a lot of these schemes are still very expensive, and a lot of low-income Londoners can still not afford, the cost. Then lastly, we have efficient housing. So here we are talking about free or subsidized schemes, like, wall cavity insulation, where at some point the government was offering to insulate wall cavities for property owners. Now, of course, when you insulate the wall cavity, it means that a lot less heating will be required in those homes, and therefore reduce on heating and therefore the use of electricity or gas in that particular house, and therefore be a lot more sustainable, because we know that if we are using gas, for example, then that is a fossil fuel and therefore is not sustainable. Then we also have other things such as solar panels, which are using renewable energy. We have wind energy, and we also have other schemes such as BEDZ. Now, BEDZ refers to Beddington Zero Energy Development in Sutton, and it's a sustainable community that promotes energy conservation. The homes here use 81% less energy for their heating, 45% less electricity, and 56% less water than other British homes. So we can see that this particular community here is a very good example of a sustainability scheme. Now, what kind of questions are you likely to get on how to make London more sustainable? So number one here is to explain one strategy for making urban living more sustainable. So you'd pick out of these strategies we've talked about and explain it. And then for a UK city you have studied, explain two strategies that have been used to make urban living more sustainable. So again, you pick two this time. Study figure 4, which shows how people travel to work in a UK city in 2011 and 2021. Of course, this here was a multiple choice question where you had options to pick from. It implies less usage of a mode of travel, which is most likely car usage for travel. Then the next question is to suggest one reason why the percentage of people traveling to work by car has declined. So improved public transport, you could talk about that. You could talk about ULEZ. You could talk about congestion charging. Then the last question says to explain one way in which green spaces can improve the quality of life in this city. Now, of course, when talking about regeneration, a lot more green or open space is provided. And because of that, it will make the city a lot more sustainable, because if you have greenery, then that greenery means that there's more absorption of carbon dioxide and release of oxygen into the atmosphere, which then implies that the air quality in those areas will be improved. The next thing that we're going to look at is London and accessible rural areas. And the example that we're going to use, and that has been recommended by our specification, is Terling, which is in Essex. Now, so Terling obviously is an accessible rural area. And it means that it's easy to get to for people who want to commute to London and back every day. You've got the A12 that goes straight into London. So that's the A12, and Terling is right here. So you can go straight into London using the A12, and the M25 is also quite close by. So depending on which part of London you want to go into, you can use the A12 to go into the eastern part of London, or you can use the M25 to access other areas of London, such as the western part of London. The other thing that makes Terling quite accessible is Hatfield Peveril Station, which is just 5 minutes away. And from that particular station, it takes only 45 minutes to get into London, which makes it quite accessible. So this is great connectivity and has made Terling one of the dormitory towns or villages in the rural urban fringe. Now, what do we mean by dormitory town or dormitory village? Now, this refers to a town or a village where people sleep at night but work elsewhere during the day. So it's in the rural urban fringe and accessible, and therefore has become a dormitory town. Now, it depends on London for work. So there is an interdependence between Terling and London, because Terling depends on London for work, because people from Terling will then commute to London and work there and get an income, which is very important. And then also for services. But then London will rely on Terling for employees to come and work in London. So in line with our specification, this interdependence is important for us to be able to explain. Then the other thing that we need to mention here is that this is an example of counter-urbanization, where people are moving away from the inner city areas to the rural urban fringe. So they are moving to the countryside, so to speak, from urban areas. And this has obviously been caused by the increasing cost of housing in London, as well as the work from home culture. And the other thing that we could add to that is that the people are seeking for a better quality of life outside the hustle and bustle of the city. So what are the benefits for accessible rural areas like Terling? So there will be increased tax revenue, obviously, because as people move into Terling, the local council is going to get a lot more money in tax revenue, which then can be reinvested into infrastructure and can create a positive multiplier effect in the area. And then we are also talking about a benefit to surrounding towns like Chelmsford, which is not too far away from Terling. This is Chelmsford here. Now, Chelmsford is a slightly bigger town, and Terling depends on Chelmsford for goods and services. So Terling depends on Chelmsford for goods and services, and this has led to an increase in Chelmsford's population. So from 58,000 people in 1971 to 181,500 in 2021. So it has tripled in 50 years. Now, what are the disadvantages? Now there's going to be higher cost of housing because the demand for housing in Terling is going up. Then it means that the supply is going to be a lot lower, and that will drive the prices up. Then the hustle of the and bustle of the city then moves into Terling, which was a quiet place originally. Then there will be pressure on available land as it's required for more building. And we know that as more of that land is being built on, then habitat is likely to be lost, meaning that the ecological sustainability of those areas, of such areas, is likely to be put in jeopardy as well. What kind of questions are we likely to get on accessible rural areas? So we have just one here, and this is for a named UK city. Explain why changes in the city have caused economic and social changes in surrounding accessible rural areas. So you could be talking about changes in London. So if we are talking about the changes that have taken place in London, you could be talking about the cost of housing, which has gone up. And as a result of that high cost of housing, then people have moved to those accessible rural areas like Terling, and they have caused economic and social changes there. Economic changes because they are bringing a positive multiplier effect there with the tax revenue that is generated. And then a social impact could be the fact that the local people are likely to be priced out of the housing market because the housing there is likely to be a lot more expensive. Another accessible rural area that we'll be talking about is Devon. And we will be specifically looking at the Met Office's relocation from just outside London to Devon. So in 2003, the Met Office relocated their offices to Devon. And these were the reasons for the move. Number one, that Devon is a very beautiful place. So it's been classed as an area of outstanding natural beauty. So AONB. And then the second reason is that the office rental is 10 times cheaper than London. Then thirdly, Devon is accessible rural. So there's Exeter Airport nearby, there's a motorway nearby, and there are 42 trains to London. So this provides great connectivity to London and other cities here in the UK. So how has Devon changed as a result of this move then, or has changed generally over time? So there has been an increase in house prices. Now, of course, as people continue to move into Devon, then there is going to be a lot more demand for housing, which then means that the prices are going to go up, and especially with retirement migration. Now, 66% of Devon is designated as an area of outstanding natural beauty, and as a result of that, obviously, there's a lot less land that is available to build on, because the rest of it, due to the designation, cannot be used for building, which then means that the demand for land that can be built on is even higher, which will drive the prices even higher. So then the second way that Devon has changed is in its demographics. So the population of Devon has actually changed quite significantly. Now we saw that there's a lot of retirement migration going into Devon, which then leads to an aging population because there are more elderly people living there, and then because there's not as much economic activity, the younger people tend to move out of Devon to go and seek opportunity in the larger towns and cities, which then leads to a brain drain in Devon, and then exacerbates that problem of an aging population. Then lastly, we have pressure on the environment due to air pollution. And obviously there's also pressure on ecologically fragile environments. And of course, the impact in terms of air pollution is as a result of the number of visitors that visit Devon every single year. In 2019, there were 30 million day visitors to Devon, which again implies a lot of air pollution because a lot of these visitors arrive by car. Okay, so what kind of questions here can we be asked in the examination. And the first one here is to state 2 reasons why some people retire to rural areas in the UK. Now, for that question, obviously, you're talking about some of the points that we have mentioned, such as the fact that Devon is an area of outstanding natural beauty. So it's a very beautiful place to live. You could also talk about the fact that it's quieter and a lot more peaceful. And there's also the perceived there's a perceived better quality of life in Devon. Then the second question, for a named UK city, explain why changes in the city have caused economic and social changes in the surrounding accessible rural areas. So this is a question that is similar to the one that was on the previous slide, and it has to do with accessible rural, Devon being one, Terling being another, and you can answer that quite easily from the information that we have discussed. Now, the next thing that our specification requires us to know about is the challenges that face rural areas here in the UK. And the example that we use in our specification is Cornwall. Now, Cornwall obviously is Devon's neighbor, but it experiences several challenges. And the first challenge is that it's a long county with no motorway. And this means that road and rail transport is slow. Now, if I remember right, I think the length of Cornwall is 170 kilometers. And of course, trying to travel across that area without a motorway and without good rail transport, it's going to be extremely slow. So that means that it's not accessible rural like Devon is. There are a lot more problems with that accessibility. And we know that in areas where accessibility is low, then moving around in such areas becomes quite expensive. Then the other problem that Cornwall has is that it has a very small population. So that then means that it does not have a large pool of potential employees, and as a result the amount of investment from businesses and TNCs will be low as a result. Then we are also talking about the fact that most of the employment there is seasonal, and it's also likely to be linked to and the reason for that seasonality is likely to be linked to the fact that a lot of these jobs are in tourism, and they also don't provide very high pay, these jobs. And as a result of that, then that's a challenge that people who live in this particular area will face. Then number 4 is poor education services. Now, local school provision is quite limited in Cornwall, with some students having to travel over 30 miles for a 6th form education. Now, of course, that then leads to a shortage of expertise and specialized skills that would be required for the knowledge economy, which would then obviously provide a much better income for the young people from Cornwall. So that is a challenge. And then the last challenge that we are talking about is poor medical provision. Now, only 38% of villages have a doctor's surgery. Now, that is less than half, and that is, quite a challenge. And most open only once a week. The main hospital nearby is in Truro, which is 30 miles away. So you can see that if there's a medical emergency, then these kind of conditions here do provide do cause a challenge. One thing that is very important for us to mention here is that the primary sector of industry has declined in Cornwall, and that has greatly impacted on Cornwall's economy. And there are several reasons why the primary industry has declined, and we shall talk about some of those. And the first one is farming. Now, farming in Cornwall has declined, especially due to falling milk prices. Now, those milk prices are normally driven down by supermarkets, and as a result of that, a lot of farmers have given up on farming, dairy products and milk as a result. Then the second one we are talking about here is fishing. So fishing has also declined in Cornwall, and of course it's in the primary sector of industry, and it has declined because of overfishing, which then has led to low fish stocks, and a lot of fishermen have also given up the trade, and the industry has declined. Then thirdly, we have mining, and the mining that we are talking about here is tin mining, and the last tin mine was actually closed down in 1998 due to declining global prices. Now, of course, when the tin mine closes, it means that a lot of jobs are likely to be lost in the area, which provides a challenge. Then finally, we have China clay quarrying. Now, this declined by 90% and has left the landscape quite scarred. Now, we know that when you're mining and the mining you're doing is open cast mining, then that is likely to make the landscape look really, really scarred and really bad. So it becomes more of an eyesore. And we know that a lot of these areas in the southwest of the UK are quite beautiful areas. And therefore, when you have the scarring taking place, then it's not helping the landscape in these areas. Okay, so questions then, exam style questions. And the first one here is to explain two reasons why TNC investment is low in rural areas in the UK. Now, of course, here you'd be talking about the fact that, the population in these areas is quite low, and therefore there are not as many workers for these TNCs to employ, and therefore the TNCs choose not to locate there. And then also you're talking about accessibility. The areas are quite remote, the transportation is poor, and therefore accessibility then becomes a problem, and therefore TNCs don't want to invest. Then the second question, explain one impact of globalization on primary sector employment in the UK. So here you can talk about China clay quarrying, and you can talk about the fact that this has declined because there is competition from overseas. So the next thing that we are going to look at are the strategies that have been used to mitigate against Cornwall's challenges. And the first one that we'll discuss here is the Eden project. Now, this is Cornwall's biggest attraction. Now, of course, bringing in a lot of tourists into the area. Now, it's made up of large plastic biomes that act as greenhouses to support a huge display of plants from rainforest and Mediterranean regions. It aims to be sustainable, having been built on an old quarry site. Now, we had mentioned China clay quarrying earlier, and we said that that quarrying has actually scarred the landscape. And these plastic biomes have been built on such a landscape, meaning that the project is quite sustainable because it's making use of disused land. So what benefits has this brought to Cornwall? It has made £6.8 billion since it was opened in 2001. It has also created jobs. There have also been 25 million visitors who have spent over £8.4 billion in the local Cornish economy. Now, there have been criticisms, however, and one of the major criticisms is that 97% of the people who arrive to visit the Eden project normally come by car, which obviously leads to a lot of congestion and air pollution. Then the second criticism has been that the visitors who come to the Eden project do not return, and therefore the visitor numbers are falling, which then begins to raise questions as to its future sustainability. The second strategy that has been used is farming diversification. And farming diversification refers to where farmers begin to do other activities other than farming to create or generate an income. Now, we did mention earlier that dairy farming has declined in Cornwall. So those farmers are seeking for alternative sources of income. And by doing that, then they are diversifying their businesses or their farming. Now, what's one of the ways they have done that? They have opened local shops or farm shops, and an example of that is Lobb's Farm Shop in South Cornwall. Now, before the diversification, there were three brothers who were earning £30,000 between them every single year. Then they opened the farm, and this farm sells beef, so not dairy products, obviously. It sells lamb, and it also sells Cornish cheese and wine, as well as other local produce. And their turnover, so income, has increased to £700,000, which is significantly more than the 30,000 they were earning previously. And they have also created 12 full-time jobs and 8 part-time jobs. Now, of course, we are also considering the fact that they are getting some of their produce locally, meaning that they are also promoting local businesses and creating employment in so doing in those other local sources that they are getting from. And apart from that, they are also generating that multiply effect that we have been talking about. Then the third strategy has been tourism accommodation. Now, this here is, of course, an example of diversification, and a lot of farms have been converted. So outbuildings, for example, have been converted into cottages, and others, so holiday cottages. Others, obviously, the land has been converted into caravan sites, campsites, and then leisure facilities have also been built, or through the conversions, leisure facilities have been installed. So facilities such as pools and spas. And of course, all of this is bringing or is with the intention of bringing an income to these farmers. And it's obviously bringing a lot more income to the area, providing rural employment and supporting the local economy. However, again, there are criticisms to this, and one of the criticisms is the loss of nesting spaces for birds. Now, of course, as the land is taken up, then the biodiversity in the area as well is likely to be reduced. And then there is also environmental damage if this is poorly managed. Okay, so what kind of questions then can we talk about for this information here? So we have a definition for farming diversification. We've talked about that, so you should be able to define farming diversification. And then for a named UK rural area, explain 2 ways that have been used to mitigate its economic and social challenges. So you can use either one of these 3 here to talk about how these economic and social challenges have been mitigated, and then explain 2 problems caused by farming diversification in the UK. So we talked about traffic and congestion due to the Eden project, and we've also talked about a loss of biodiversity. So those are 2 problems that you could talk about here. That brings us to the end of this video on the UK's evolving human landscape. This video only covers section B of paper 2. I have previously done revision videos for all 3 sections of paper 2. You can therefore watch the video for topic 4 and topic 6. They will be linked in the description. I'm also aiming to do a video for the most examined areas for paper 3, which is on the 11th of June 2026. Please ensure that you're subscribed if you'd like to be notified when I post it. The revision videos that I have done for paper 3 are also linked in the description. Thanks once again for joining in this journey towards excellent exam results. The very best wishes in your revision and exam, and see you again soon. Bye-bye.